Chapter 80. Take one. Yes, sect leader. Eungum reached out and took a teacup. Plum tea, made by drying plum petals, is one of the things that Hyunjung is most proud of. Bringing that tea out meant there was quite a lot to talk about today. How is it? Before Eungum answered, he glanced at Eunam. He was checking whether it was fine to speak in the presence of others. Hyunjung, who took the tea, recognized this and said, "It is fine." Yes then. Eungum opened his mouth. As the sect leader said, I didn't intervene, and... There seems to be a bit of a problem. Hyunjung nodded at it. The atmosphere would have turned sour if Hyunhyun Sasuk hadn't arrived when he did. As the sect leader said, there are subtle sparks flowing between the second and third class disciples. I see. Hyunjung sighed. This happened because of their decision. I was in a hurry. The difference between the Un disciples and the Baek disciples was too great, and the difference between the Baek and the Chung disciples was too close. As a result, the youngest of the Baek disciples, Yu Yi-sol, was almost the same age as Yunjung, the oldest of the Chung disciples. Given that it was customary to have a few years difference between any group of disciples, it was apparent that this problem would explode at some point. It was inevitable. When they received the third-class disciples, Mount Hua couldn't actually afford to accept any new disciples. At that time, the sect's finances were dwindling to a dangerous low. It had grown so severe that new students were barred from joining. Then, someone suggested the idea of getting support from the disciples' families in return for allowing their children to join the sect. That was the beginning of the problem. With Mount Hua desperately struggling to hold together their crumbling foundations, it was necessary to gather funds by any means available to them. However, even if they had fallen from grace, Mount Hua was still a prestigious sect. They tried to be selective of who they accepted, but for the sake of the disciples who would grow up within the sect, they took the disciples of families who offered support without question. As a result, the Chung disciples are somewhat lacking in martial arts talent. In the past, the Chung disciples wouldn't have dared to act against the Baek disciples. But aren't the Chung disciples now different from what they were? Yes. Did they have a central figure? Didn't that figure change? A seemingly meaningless change began to ripple out and influence much more than expected. A single individual's existence was affecting not only their group, but also the relations between other groups. With Yunjung and Jogul as the center of the Chung disciples, they barely passed as third-class disciples of Mount Hua. However, now, the third-class disciples were gathered around Chungmyeong, who isn't satisfied with merely passing but wants excellent results. People who are 20 years apart don't see each other as competition, but those who are 10 years apart, or even less, have no choice but to be conscious of each other. It's my fault. As Eungum bowed his head, Hyunjung firmly shook his head. It isn't your fault. Sect leader, I was the one who insisted that you be the head of the White Plum Blossom boarding hall. Didn't everyone agree at that time? In the first place, this is something we all predicted when we started receiving the third-class disciples ahead of schedule. These words weren't just meant to comfort Eungum. Mount Hua benefited a lot after creating the White Plum Blossom dorms. But where there is something to gain, there is something to lose. In the past, no junior would dare to skip the formalities with their seniors, regardless of the age difference. However, the third-class disciples never received anything from the second-class disciples. They were taught by Eungum and trained together with their comrades. Naturally, the distance between the two groups was bound to widen. That was the biggest weakness of the White Plum Blossom boarding hall. Eungum glanced at Hyunjung and asked, Sect leader, what do you believe we should do? Hyunjung savored the plum tea without saying a word. It felt calming to him, smelling the subtle scent wafting through the air. What can we do? But leaving it like this. People are always like that. Would their hearts be satisfied if we intervene and forcefully lead the situation? Sometimes, it isn't wrong to let the disciples clash with each other and learn from the disagreements. Sect leader, this is about our disciples. If you put your mind to it, you could even change the direction of a river. But if you force the stream to turn, even if it seems plausible at first, there will be problems that arise farther down the flow. Hyunjong said with a smile. Ungom. Yes, sect leader. Let's trust our children. Ungom looked at Hyunjong with a complicated expression. The expression said he had doubts about this. At that time, Hyunjong spoke about a different topic than Ungom expected. Baekchun isn't that kind of problem child. Huh? Don't you think so too? Ungom's face went stiff. No, it isn't him, sect leader. Baekchun isn't the problem. Sect leader, the problem is Chongmyeong. Only then did Ungom realize that there was a huge gap in the way that the other elders saw Chongmyeong compared to him. The head of the White Plum Blossom dorms, Ungom, saw Chongmyeong up close as he controlled the third-class disciples. However, Hyunjong and the other elders only saw him as an adorable little puppy that brought blessings to Mount Hua. Isn't Baekchun a careful and upright child? Even if his pride gets damaged and he loses himself to a moment of anger, he isn't the sort of person to harm a child because of it. Pardon? Who will hurt whom? Baekchun will hurt Chongmyeong? That's crazy. Somehow, the sect leader was too naive. However, explaining it seemed impossible. No, even if he could explain it, the sect leader wouldn't believe it. In fact, Ungom doesn't fully understand Chongmyeong himself. The way that the sect leader saw Chongmyeong was miles apart from how Ungom viewed him. How could he possibly convince Hyunjong? Yes, I understand, sect leader. In the end, Ungom had no choice but to silently leave. Ungom. Yes, sect leader. There isn't much time left before the conference. As soon as the word conference came out, Ungom's face darkened. To be honest, the disciples of Mount Hua didn't have any negative feelings toward the Jungnam sect in the past. In the first place, Mount Hua's feelings for the Jungnam sect had stemmed from a competitive spirit. But isn't competition inherently between people who are similar and not too different? The gap between Mount Hua and the Jungnam sect was like heaven and earth. No one had the burning spirit necessary to take down the Jungnam sect. But even if there was no motivation in this competition, who would want to see their disciples get beat up by the other side? For the youngest children, the difference between them isn't too great, and the loss is not too humiliating. However, the difference more than doubles when the older disciples take center stage, and it only grows farther when those who train directly under an elder appear. We've solved many problems, but the most important problem hasn't been solved yet. We are only at the beginning, and we need to recreate the splendid glory of Mount Hua. I'll keep that in mind, sect leader. Right. Both of you can leave. Yes. As Ungom and Unam left, Hyunjong got up from his seat and opened the window at the back of his room so he could see the peaks with melted snow. There were small flower buds on the plum tree that had grown fast. By the time the conference begins, spring plum blossoms will likely bloom all over the mountain. Plum blossoms. Plum blossoms. The seven sages' sword is back. However, Hyunjong was keenly aware of the fact that it was impossible to reproduce their past glory with just one sword art. Perhaps if we still had the plum blossom sword technique. Hyunjong tightly shut his eyes. He knew that dwelling on what was lost in the past wouldn't bring about a change. This wasn't the time to search for what they lacked. It was time to reinforce what they had. Even so, regret lingered in the corner of his heart. Oh, ancestors, look down on Mount Hua. Hyunjong was still unaware that an ancestor had already descended on Mount Hua. Unfortunately, Hyunjong made two mistakes. One was that he thought Chongmyeong was a good child. But from Mount Hua's point of view, it wasn't a large issue. Chongmyeong's ultimate goal was to help Mount Hua. The more Hyunjong favored Chongmyeong, the wider his activities could be. It wasn't intentional, but thanks to Hyunjong giving preferential treatment To Chungmyeong, Mount Hua was developing faster. But the other mistake was more fatal. Baekchun was not as mild-mannered or gentle as Hyunjung thought. Anything. Need food. The third-class disciples, huddled together in their boarding hall, had shocking faces. Chungmyeong's practice left the disciples completely drained. He could somehow gauge the strength remaining in each and every disciple and would cruelly use that information to push them to their absolute limits, squeezing out every last drop of sweat from their bodies. Therefore, after everyone was done training, they would come back with stiff faces and sunken cheeks. Surprisingly, however, no third-class disciples expressed dissatisfaction from the harsh training. Of course, they felt like they would die each time they practiced under him, but weren't humans known to be adaptable. After this terrible training was repeated for over a week, it somehow became more bearable. They've developed so much that even when they stumbled into the underworld and locked eyes with the villainous death, they turn their backs on the Grim Reaper and return on their own. The more that iron is beaten, the stronger it becomes. And the more a man gets beaten, the stronger he returns. Moss doesn't gather on a man that's been beaten. Moss doesn't normally grow on people anyway, you madman. Even worse was that the third-class disciples could see that Chungmyeong was right. They could feel their bodies changing day by day. Now they understood what it meant to have a fit body. But the problem was that a new calamity struck the third-class disciples who believed they could overcome anything if they just followed Chungmyeong's training routine. I think I'm going to die. The Sasuks are seriously... Isn't it getting worse each time? The Baek disciples were tormenting them. That day, after Chungmyeong and Baekchun confronted each other, they began skillfully bullying the third-class disciples. It was clear that they were deliberately harassing them on each occasion. Why are they doing that? Do you even need to ask? All eyes turned to the same location, and the one at the end of the gaze was... Huh? Chungmyeong, who received their gazes, just tilted his head. Why are you looking at me? This bastard was definitely born without a conscience.